Hello, welcome back to my haunted library. It's Regina. I'm continuing on with Robert McKee's story. So this chapter is structure and setting the war on cliche. So he talks about how a lot of times the ideas we get for our stories are not coming from life and they're not coming from truth. They're coming from other shows, TV, movies, and books that we've read. And I think that is really true. And we have to be cautious about that as far as it's not even stealing, it's just that we're not going deep enough. So he talks about setting here. A story setting is four-dimensional: period, duration, location, and level of conflict. I'm glad my camera's doing weird things. I'm glad that he mentions that the setting is part of the conflict, because that's really true. If you work in whatever setting that you're working in, that can be its own tension point, and it should be. Whether it's a small town and you're dealing with the small-mindedness of a small town, or you're in like a war-torn country in the midst of incredible chaos. A story setting is four-dimensional: period, duration, location, level of conflict. So the first one is, what time period does this take place? Is it contemporary? Is it a history? That will definitely have an effect on what your story is about and all kinds of different opportunities for conflict. The next is the duration, how much of a time period does this take place? Is it like an epic that lasts for 10 years or even more, or is it happen within like a 24-hour period? So a location is a story's place in space. So think about the location. Obviously, locations can change, especially in a novel, and more so than in like a play where you're limited, but somewhat limited, depending on the play. But a novel can go all over the place. It could go into other worlds, other dimensions, fantasy worlds, etc. The setting is like its own character. It's going to have a major effect on what your story is about. So it's really important that you get it right. And McKee makes the point that the way to get that right is through research. And then this he mentions, which I think is really important, and I'm going to read it. A story must obey its own internal laws of probability. The event choices of the writer, therefore, are limited to the possibilities and probabilities within the world he creates. So this is really important, especially, and he does mention this, if you are doing a fantasy story. If you're doing a fantasy story that you have your own, or science fiction, something that is otherworldly, not in the everyday world, that you have to create your own laws about that, and those have to be ironclad and you can't break them. We all love Game of Thrones, but if you were to change the rules and suddenly land a spaceship somewhere, you would make everyone really go crazy because you have violated the rules of the story. So these things are important. You can't just have a character suddenly be able to fly if it's already been established that they can't fly, unless something happens really important that makes that happen. They get a spell cast on them, or I don't know, they wake up with wings or something. But it has to be within the reality of your story. That seems kind of self-evident, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of that sometimes, because I have read stories where they break that rule and it really is a mistake. The principle of creative limitation. I really love this idea. He writes about the importance of having constraints, and the constraint will actually set you free. And I totally agree with that. If you create your world and make it really tight, then within that scope, a lot of stuff can go on. But if you really leave it open-ended, it kind of gives you too much freedom, and there's something about the constraint and the limitation that is more conducive to creativity, because you have to think more imaginatively. You have to come up with problem-solving ideas, and that will get you thinking more creatively instead of just being like, well, I can have this character, if they get trapped, they can just become invisible. Well, if you haven't established that already, then that could be a problem. So he talks about research, and in this book was written over 20 years ago. He mentions going to libraries versus going online and Googling things. And I do think actual physical research is important. And when you're choosing your location, it's really important that you know this location, unless you're completely making it up, which is cool. But even then, you have to know it even more. I would never put a major setting into my story unless I knew it really well. Most of my books are set either in the rural Pennsylvania world that I know, that I grew up in, or New York City, where I lived for 10 years and feel like I know that city pretty well. I know the way the sun comes over the Hudson, what that looks like, the smell of the subway. All of these things I know from being in that city. If I were to try to write in detail about a city like London, which I've never been to, I'd love to go, but I've never been there. I can imagine it from things that I've read and movies that I've seen, but I won't be an authority. So, and not that you have to have lived in a place, but you have to really do your research so you are an authority on that place. So he talks about, in the research, memory of your own experiences. You want to connect with your reader into something universal that they will really feel. And if you are being truthful about those emotions and finding them, and that is a tricky thing. It's not just about, being emotional on the page, but that you're really digging into some truth. That's ideal because you will hit that with your audience and your reader and really resonate with them. So, and the next one is imagination. So that's the fun part, at least for me, is when you really think about your character and get to know them so well that you know their life from start to finish, and you're not going to include all of that in your book, but then you really know them. And that gives your character depth, and that makes your reader connect with your character because they know them too. These are people they know, and they get to know them very well, and they have strong feelings about them. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this. I think it's kind of interesting. Fact: have you ever had writer's block? Scary, isn't it? Days drag by and nothing gets written. Cleaning the garage looks like fun. You rearrange your desk over and over until you think you're losing your mind. I know a cure, but it isn't a trip to your psychiatrist. It's a trip to the library. So he's writing about library, and today we probably would just go online and Google it. But doing research, really getting involved. Like, let's say you want to write a story and you said, I'm going to have this psychopath killer. Well, instead of just thinking about what a psychopath is from the movies that you've watched or the news that you read, actually do some research into the psychology of that kind of person and find out some great details. Really dig in. There's so much available now for research, so there's really no excuse. So, and then he ends it with talking about how your creative choices, and I like this quote too, he's got a lot of great quotes. Creativity means creative choices of inclusion and exclusion. So you are constantly weeding through all of this material and deciding what you're going to include, because you can't include it all, and also deciding what you're going to get rid of. And that is the creative process. You are weeding through, you're making decisions. Ever read a book where they over-describe a room? You go in, the character walks into a living room and you know everything that's on the shelf, and you start to wonder why. And that is poor writing, in my opinion, because you are getting too much information about this room that really means nothing to what's happening in the story. But if the writer just gives you little pieces, and we've all seen that done well too, like maybe there's a thin layer of dust across the shelf. Now automatically that's making you think, well, either this person is a poor housekeeper, or it's been a long time since someone's been in this room, or they're a slob, or there's some a fingerprint in the dust, so someone was there. So you can include different things, or maybe there's a photograph that's been ripped up and then someone taped it back together and put it in a frame. That's telling us a story instead of just going into all this detail. Now, I like to give a little bit of that when I'm describing a setting. I think it's important to give a picture, but you also want to let your reader fill in the blanks. George R.R. Martin is really good at that, of choosing which moments to emphasize and which to not. That comes down to talent. It also comes down to practice. So next week I'll be back with chapter 4 of Robert McKee's story. I might be the only one left in the Goodreads thread, but oh well, I'll get through it. Thanks for stopping in my haunted library, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.